As you know, Iran has been under sanctions for some time now, and what we thought we would do is to have a reasoned academic discussion on the nature of the sanctions, on the consequences of the sanctions, and what they mean and what consequences they have for the average people, for Iranian society at large, and also what they entail. What is the predominant characteristic of these sanctions? So what I wanted to do very briefly tonight was to start our discussion by giving you a very brief summary of the history of sanctions, looking at the assumption behind the sanctions. What are some of the assumptions that underlie the sanction regime imposed on Iran? Why are they there? What is the scope of the sanctions? What do they entail? And lastly, look very briefly at how Iranian people feel based on available empirical evidence about the sanctions. What are some of the common perceptions in Iran on the sanctions and how people are coping with them? Manata will look at how sanctions what means people are trying to use to get around the sanctions, or how people are coping with them in terms of how it affects their daily lives. And Mansoor will also look at what sanctions mean in terms of social movements, in particular movement towards democratization and democracy in Iran. So let me begin with a very quick rundown of the sanctions and history of sanctions. Sanctions imposed on Iran are nothing new. In fact, as soon as the American diplomats were taken hostage in Tehran, the United States imposed wide-ranging sanctions on Iran. And these sanctions existed for something close approach to 20 years, and then they became codified right during the Clinton administration. The Clinton administration in 1996 passed the Iran Sanctions Act, and Iran sanctions then became part of stated US foreign policy, in which a whole range of items were sanctioned for export to Iran or importing from Iran. And then the ISA, Iran Sanctions Act, stayed in force for some time, and until actually the beginning of the Obama administration, where the United States then ratcheted up the nature of the sanctions. And you will see an interesting pattern emerge here, whereby the United States increasingly goes and imposes more official or more tighter sanctions on Iran, but it doesn't necessarily the Bush administration took a much more hawkish approach toward Iran, but it was the the Obama administration that has been far more aggressive in terms of the sanctions regime. And why is that? I think part of the reason for this is because President Obama has been trying to keep the Republicans in the House and the Senate at bay by saying, let's not invade or attack Iran, whereas the Bush administration was far more hawkish and aggressive in its approach toward Iran. The Obama administration has been saying, look, let us go through the legislative route and tighten sanctions. And of course, what the Obama administration has done has been to continue this increasingly tighter and tighter sanctions regime. Right now, as we speak, there is a bill in the House of Congress, H.R. 850, that is working its way through the U.S. Congress to have the sanctions regime even tighter. What the Bush administration did, at the same time as it was talking about all options being on the table, it went to the United Nations and had the United Nations pass a series of resolutions that, again, tightened sanctions on Iran. And we see that of the 4 sanctions that the UN has passed on Iranian sanctions, 3 have been under the Bush administration, and only the latest one, the last one, was really as a result of what Obama has done. And again, this is part of this assumption that what President Obama has been trying to do is to keep the Republicans at bay, saying, let's give diplomacy a chance, let's go through institutional, congressional means, tighten sanctions, and let's not talk so much about all options being on the table, which was something that the Bush administration frequently talked about. Now, why did the United States impose sanctions on Iran to begin with? Well, as far back as 1978-79, those sanctions, as I mentioned, were imposed on Iran because of the hostage crisis, but they were not really codified until the 1990s, when the United States became far more concerned about Iran's nuclear program. Throughout the 1980s, the US didn't really think that Iran had a nuclear program. Remember, from 1980 to 1988, we saw the longest war of the 20th century, the war between Iran and Iraq. And it was only in the latter half of the 1990s when Iran's nuclear program got going and when the United States became far more concerned. So the original assumption about the sanctions, at least insofar as American thinking was concerned, was to ensure that the nuclear program in Iran doesn't progress beyond a red line, or doesn't progress beyond a point where Iran develops so-called breakthrough capacity, where it can put together a bomb. And of course, the assumption was that once this nuclear program is finished, or once it's stopped, and once Iran in particular stops enriching its nuclear materials, then the sanctions would be lifted. And again, from the very beginning, the assumption has been that sanctions are meant to stop Iran's nuclear program, and then they would be lifted at such time when the United States thinks that it could lift these. Now, these sanctions have become increasingly more inclusive in terms of their scope, in terms of their depth and their breadth, in terms of what they include insofar as what Iran can do and what it cannot do. When we look at the scope of the sanctions, in terms of what it is that they include, from the very beginning, from 1978-79, the assumption was that Iran should not have so-called dual-use technology, technology that could be used for both civilian as well as military purposes. And of course, this is important to keep in mind because this includes aircraft. It includes not just military hardware, but it includes jetliners. It includes spare parts. So when you talk about dual-use technology, you're looking at a whole spectrum of technological goods and items that are really used for civilian purposes, of course the first one being aircraft. And you know that Iran, for example, has had tremendously difficult times furnishing and refurbishing its Boeing jetliners, passenger jetliners, and it's been up until into the 1990s, it was allowed to purchase some Airbus planes and some old Boeing planes from Turkey, from some other countries, but now under increasingly more comprehensive sanctions, it can't even do that. And so this dual-use technology is important to take note of because it includes a whole host of civilian technological goods and other products that become extremely comprehensive. But also, of course, part of the sanctions regime are Iranian exports. And increasingly now we've seen over the last year or so that Iran is having a difficult time selling its petroleum. Now, finally, petroleum has been included under the sanctions regime, and Iran is having to barter its petroleum, and I'll talk in a minute about bartering regime. Now, interestingly, this Iranian exports and the sanctions which they're under is interesting to look at because during the Clinton administration in the 1990s, in order to show its goodwill, the United States lifted sanctions on 3 Iranian exports: carpets, caviar, and pistachio nuts, as a goodwill gesture. And then within a matter of about less than a year, those sanctions were reimposed during the Bush administration. Now, where Iran, the one sanction that hurts civilians as well as non-civilians or Iranian government, are the comprehensive sanctions on Iranian banking system. Iran is now under sanctions insofar as the SWIFT regime is concerned. If you're trying to wire money, as all of you know, you got to go to the bank and you have to produce a SWIFT code. Each bank has a SWIFT code where you can then engage in a financial transaction. Now, this Iranian banks being under sanctions is important because the United States has said, well, certain humanitarian items, such as, for example, medicine, are exempt from the sanctions regime, or medical equipment is exempt from sanctions regime. But you cannot actually export medicine or medical equipment to Iran because you can't get them to Iran. Iranians can't technically pay for them because of the sanctions on the SWIFT regime. There are also specific individuals and organizations that are subject to sanctions. 490 Iranian institutions and organizations are under sanctions, meaning they cannot engage in trade or imports or export, and about 105 individuals, both people in the government, folks in the Iranian government, as well as people in the Iranian military and the Islamic Revolutionary Guards Corps, are subject to sanctions. And what that means, what individual sanctions mean, is that they cannot technically travel to, for example, European Union countries. And so that's another sanctions. Now, these sanctions are comprehensive, and no doubt they have consequences in terms of people's daily lives. And so just a couple of months ago, actually about 4 months ago, the Gallup organization did a comprehensive poll of about 1,500 Iranians and asked them what the sanctions mean to them on a day-to-day basis. And one of the questions that Gallup asked was, do sanctions personally hurt you? They asked actually a few related questions. One of the questions was, do sanctions hurt Iranians in general? And the numbers closely mirror one another. And one of the questions they asked was, do the sanctions hurt you personally? And the answers that were given were quite interesting, quite informative. About 48% said the sanctions personally hurt a great deal. Another 35% said the sanctions hurt somewhat personally. 14% said they do not hurt at all, and another 2% didn't know or refused to answer, didn't give answer. Now, anytime you do a poll of this nature, there is a great margin of error, or you got to take it with a grain of salt. And surely this poll has to be taken with a grain of salt. But the picture that it paints, I don't think can be ignored. The picture is one of tremendous sense of personal suffering. The picture is one that individuals feel that they are directly, personally suffering as a result of the sanctions. Interestingly, when you put this figure and this poll in a comparative perspective, and you look at other Middle Eastern regions, and so what is your rate of suffering versus some other people in their rate of some other countries, their rate of suffering, an interesting picture emerges. Fully 31% of Iranians feel that they are suffering. And if you think of the other Middle East countries that have comparable rates of suffering, you see those are countries that have either been under occupation and invasion, or there have been countries that have experienced the Arab Spring. Interestingly, Iran, that has not had an Arab Spring, or it has not had an invasion and occupation, is really on par with Iraq and Afghanistan. 33% of people in Afghanistan and Egypt, and 32% of people in Tunisia feel that they are personally suffering, and 31% of Iranians, and only 29% of Iraqis. And when you think of the abject misery that the people of Iraq have suffered since 2003, you begin to develop a picture, and 23% of Yemenis, and we know that Yemen has long been on the verge of implosion. Now, interestingly, we remember that the nuclear program is the primary cause for the sense of suffering that people have. And then when Gallup asked people, should the government stop its nuclear program or not, 63% of Iranians said, no, it should not stop the nuclear program. This poll was conducted in December of 2012, about 4 months ago. And then another 17% said, no, the government should not continue its nuclear program, and another 19% either refused to answer or didn't know. Again, even if you take this with a huge grain of salt, a picture emerges that there's tremendous support domestically. Despite tremendous suffering, there's still tremendous support for the Iranian nuclear program. How do the Iranians, and who do the Iranians blame? Gallup has an interesting answer. Who do they blame the most for the sanctions? Is it the Iranian government, or is it somebody else? 47% of Iranians blame the United States for sanctions. 10% blame the Iranian government, 9% blame Israel, 7% Western European countries, 7% United Nations, 3% somebody else, and 17% don't know and refuse to answer. Now, even if you add the 3% and the 17% and say, well, you know what, these people were scared of answering, you get a 20% answer of people who are blaming the Iranian government versus 47% who are blaming the US government. Again, there is this perception of tremendous misery and suffering in Iran, and I think the sanctions are actually having the opposite effect that what people are, as compared to what the United States intended. What conclusions can we reach? Let me end by summarizing some of the conclusions that can be reached from the statistics and the data I just showed you. 4 broad conclusions, I think, can be teased out of the what I just mentioned. First and foremost, sanctions have become the favored U.S. instrument of pressure. They've become the favored kind of pressure that the United States has. And if you go back to the original fact that I mentioned in terms of the sanctions that have made their way through the US Congress since 2010, we see a picture emerge that they've become the favored US pressure. I tend to think that the United States is not going to attack Iran, although it's going to continue to increasingly tighten the sanctions. Another picture that is undeniable is that there's tremendous suffering, or at least a self-perception of suffering among the Iranian people. But at the same time, I think there's also a high level of support for the nuclear program, and I think at the same time, the US is getting largely the blame for the Iranian predicament on the part of the Iranian people. I'll end it here, and then we'll have some questions and answers. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Good evening. It's a pleasure to be here with all of you tonight. There was a recent article in the Washington Times with the title, "Despair Spreads in the Islamic Republic." In it, the author spoke about the utter misery of ordinary people in Iran in the aftermath of the tightening of US and EU-led sanctions. Next to the feeling of despair is a sense of powerlessness to effect any change, the article stated. referring to the seeming inability of ordinary individuals to make a dent in their living conditions. This article isn't unique. In fact, over and over again in media outlets, you'll find common refrains like depths of despair and social catastrophe to describe the squeeze of escalating international sanctions on everyday life and on ordinary people in Iran. The impression these media commentaries leave is that daily life under sanctions is a disaster, and that there's a pervading sense of apathy and vulnerability as people struggle to survive. But how accurate are these claims about the despair and distress of Iranians inside the country? In the few minutes I have, I'd like to first talk a bit about the broader socioeconomic impact of the sanctions, building off a bit of what Dr. Kamrava just said, and then a bit about how ordinary Iranians are managing daily life. And then I'd like to end by drawing a connection between the two. So first of all, let's take a look at Iran's economic and social landscape under sanctions. As a result of US sanctions and an EU embargo on Iranian oil, Iran's oil exports, which make up 2/3 of its economy, have fallen dramatically and have created a 40% drop in oil revenues. More significant are the financial prohibitions that have blacklisted Iranian banks, denying them access to international money and credit channels. This has created a slide in the Iranian rial, which has lost about 80% of its value against the US dollar since the end of 2011. So what do all these facts and figures mean on a more micro level? It means that there's been a dramatic upsurge in the price of imported goods while people's purchasing power has declined. Chicken prices, for example, have nearly tripled in cost as the cost of buying feed from abroad has spiked. But it's not just imported goods that have seen a price increase. The price of goods that are produced locally have also increased, as some merchants use the slide in the rial as an excuse to raise prices. Macro-level changes in the economy spurred by the sanctions have also meant that accessing raw materials for production has become prohibitively expensive, and this has forced the closure of hundreds of factories, resulting in increasing unemployment rates. The automobile sector, for instance, has been devastated by the high cost of imported parts. The price of a Pride, which is the most common car in Iran today, has practically doubled in price, which means that Iranians who were able to afford the car just a year ago no longer can. Output has also been cut in half in the past year, and this has meant a loss in jobs for thousands of individuals as some parts plants have closed. And finally, and most importantly, the financial prohibitions under sanctions have meant an imposing humanitarian crisis. Iran's currently facing a shortage of life-saving drugs for the treatment of illnesses, including cancer, diabetes, hemophilia, MS, and HIV. While pharmaceuticals don't fall under sanctions, and this was a point that Dr. Kamrava touched upon as well, the inability of Iran to use the international payment system has meant that it can't get access to many of these medicines because they simply can't send payments to the foreign companies who supply them. The delivery of agricultural products to Iran has also been affected for the same reasons. So even though food and medicine are technically exempt from sanctions, it really ends up being a catch-22. So given this depiction that I've just given you of the socioeconomic landscape in Iran, the important question really becomes, how are people coping, right? And especially, how are those people in the lower echelons of society coping with life under sanctions? We know that the sanctions have certainly bitten. They've brought inflation and a collapse in the currency. They've harmed many economic prospects for ordinary people. And not surprisingly, they've solidified general sentiment against the West. Under these circumstances, it's really easy to, as the Washington Times has, that ordinary Iranians are simply sitting around waiting for the broader economic landscape to change. But as is usually the case, the reality on the ground is always a bit more nuanced than what this big picture suggests. Government cash handouts, for example, have helped to soften the impact of inflation on poorer families by keeping staple foods and utility expenses affordable for them. Non-governmental organizations, NGOs, have also contributed to mitigating the effects of sanctions by distributing non-cash material goods, like clothes, school supplies, and other essentials to the poorest. People in the lower and middle echelons of society, those that sanctions historically bite the most, have also found their own ways to soften the impact of the rial's depreciation. And often these strategies are simply a continuation of tactics they've used in the past to not simply make ends meet, but more importantly, to save face, to gain elements of prestige, and to move forward and improve their lives in the face of difficulty. So for instance, some take on additional jobs in the informal economy to keep the standard of living they were accustomed to. These jobs range from taxi driving, house cleaning, to even construction work. Others take on additional work for family members who are self-employed business people. Some even work for these family businesses for little or no pay in return for an exchange like free housing. Those who are more enterprising and have some savings of their own start their own businesses, often converting a spare bedroom into a fully functioning salon, or providing carpentry services to neighbors and acquaintances on demand. Iranians who seek to improve their socioeconomic situation in more discreet ways participate in informal exchange networks. So for example, they participate in vertical networks with better off relatives and with their employers. These vertical ties are based on a system of reciprocity. And so what this means is that employers and wealthier kin members provide the individual with cash or in-kind resources, like bonuses, college tuition benefits, or even home furnishings. And to avoid shame and to preserve their honor, the individual in need then returns the favor by assuming extra work responsibilities for their employers, or by performing extra chores and babysitting duties for family members. People also participate in horizontal exchange networks with family members or peers from similar economic backgrounds as themselves. These types of networks often take the form of rotating credit and savings associations, what we know more informally as group lending microcredit schemes, or what they're called in Iran, dores. In these types of associations, groups of individuals agree to meet on a regular basis in order to save and to borrow communally. These dores, or associations, allow both men and women to acquire relatively small-scale, interest-free loans that they can then use to pay for whatever they wish, usually household expenses. And younger Iranians, too, create their own networks of mutual aid in order to receive non-cash material goods. These networks often consist of clothing exchanges and involve exchanging fashionable or trendy items of clothing, shoes, and accessories with friends and family members. This practice enables them to constantly have a new outfit on rotation, to constantly wear a new outfit every day, which is in itself an indicator of high status among youth groups in the country. So by allowing youth access to material possessions, not only do these types of clothing exchange networks help them keep personal expenses to a minimum, but more importantly, they serve as a way for them to save face and to keep up their reputation among their peers. And finally, the most obvious strategy that people use to deal with sanctions is to transform their shopping habits. So for instance, Iranians have been slowly abandoning imports in favor of certain domestic goods, like cosmetic items and home appliances. Domestic goods like these have traditionally been shunned for more prestigious branded items from Europe and Asia. While Iranians have historically associated foreign products as higher status and wanted to be seen by others as consuming imports over domestic goods as a way to keep up appearances, there's been a change in attitudes, and that people are realizing that many of the domestically made products they've bypassed in the past are as or sometimes even better quality than their imported counterparts. The move back to local brands is also more cost efficient. So for example, a bottle of Iranian-made shampoo, which is specifically designed for consumers in Iran since it's custom-made for the country's climate, is approximately 5 times cheaper than its foreign-made counterpart. So people aren't just becoming more conscious of their spending habits, which is necessarily the case when prices increase, but they're also altering their attitudes about the quality of Iran's own domestic goods and concluding that the label "Made in Iran" doesn't signal inferior quality. So given all this, we see that despite the hardships that the sanctions have posed, Iranians inside the country are finding ways to navigate around them, to resist some of their more debilitating effects, and even to accrue small social and economic gains in spite of them. Why is it important for us to know this? And it's here where I want to more explicitly draw the connection between sanctions and conditions of economic hardship more generally and individual behaviors. If you go to any news article about life under sanctions in Iran, you'll find a common thread, that people have no hope, that people are adapting to increasing economic hardship by leveling their aspirations, and that lower-class young people, faced with rising unemployment under sanctions, are increasingly turning to crime as a way to deal. But the fact is that people don't develop the tactics that I've just discussed with you if they're simply looking to survive, which is what a lack of hope implies. Rather, they're going about their everyday activities and winning small gains, whether in the workplace, in the home, in the bazaar, or even in their communities, with the hope that their lives will get better and with the hope to secure a dignified life. And this is the important part. Their hopes for the good life manifest themselves in 2 ways: in their desires to save face and to gain elements of prestige, and in their more specific desires for particular goods and outcomes, such as trendy clothes or jobs, that are tied up with these more general norms. People use the money they save from buying less, from making do without, or from taking on second and third jobs to open up small businesses for themselves or for their children, to buy assets like plots of land, which see much less depreciation, to pay for higher education or for vocational training, all of which enable them to become incrementally mobile. And in doing all of these activities, they're actively attempting to shape their futures. They involve themselves in silent, individualistic struggles to resist the debilitating effects of economic meltdowns. And in this context, their struggles aren't really any different from other low-income demographic groups in the developed and developing worlds today. And what these struggles show is that a lack of economic resources doesn't always lead to inertia in attempts to move forward, but to increased effort. And this rather simple notion can really help us to uncover exactly how conditions of economic uncertainty affect people's saving strategies, their labor market behaviors, and more generally, their future-oriented tactics. And once we do this, we can begin to provide people with tools that can help them to better invest in their futures. Thank you so much.
Good evening. Professor Kamrava, thank you very much for including me in this panel. I'm very glad to be here. A smart sanction or democratization of Iran versus crippling sanctions or war by other means. In this talk, I would like to assess the future of the Islamic Republic and the prospect for democracy in light of 2 major challenges the regime faces. One is the unity of the international community against the nuclear policy of the Islamic Republic and the imposition of crippling sanctions. And the other is the rise of alternative liberal nationalist opposition movement among Iranians. My argument is that if worked together, these 2 major forces are capable of transforming the Islamic regime and contributing to the rise of moderate and democratic politics in Iran. The problem is that these 2 forces do not speak to one another. There is little coordination between sanctioned regimes and democratic regimes. What is more, the sanctions appear to have more adverse effect on the forces favoring democratization of Iran than undermining the regime's capability. The transformation of Iran from a US ally to one of its prominent enemies was a consequence of the Iranian Revolution of 1979. The seizure of the US Embassy in 1979 by radical Muslim students and the taking of its personnel as hostages radically changed the nature of US-Iran relations. As a consequence, the US sanction against Iran started with President Carter's executive order in November 1979, freezing about $12 billion in Iranian assets. Over the year, the restrictions have become increasingly harsh, culminating in the Comprehensive Iran Sanctions Accountability and Divestment Act in 2010. It should be noted that not all interest groups shaping US policy toward Iran were in consensus on sanctions. The pro-Israeli lobbyists have been consistently in favor of expanding crippling sanctions against Iran. The US corporation, on the other hand, at least some crucial of them, were in favor of easing the sanctions under the rubric of engaging Iran. These include Unicor, Motorola, Mobil, as well as National Association of Wheat Growers, the Caterpillar, for example. It should also be mentioned that the US trajectory of sanctions against Iran was also a function of Iran's domestic politics. The election of President Khatami, a reformist and moderate politician, was a welcome development from the American perspective. In fact, the US government tried very hard to establish a better relationship with the Islamic regime. In April 1999, President Clinton went out of his way to say he was trying to understand Iran. He said it was important to recognize that Iran has been the subject of quite a lot of abuse from various Western nations. The ultimate change of heart toward Iran was expressed by Madeleine Albright, who in a speech on March 17, 2000, acknowledged that in 1953, the United States played a significant role in orchestrating the overthrow of Iran's popular Prime Minister, Mohammad Mossadegh. And the coup was clearly a setback for Iran's political development, and it is easy to see why so many Iranians continue to resent this intervention by America in their internal affairs. The Islamic Republic did not take these overtures seriously. In addition, a host of factors arrested this trend and strengthened the position of those favoring more severe sanctions against Iran. Including among these factors were the Islamic regime's continued support for Muslim extremists in the region, the discovery that the Iraqi government that had made considerable progress in the development of weapons of mass destruction, which by implication raised concern about the Iran objective, or the terrorist event of 9/11, and the election of Ahmadinejad. Past sanctions were limited and inconsistent, and it is too early to tell the effectiveness of the current crippling sanction in forcing the regime to change its nuclear policy. According to some analysts, sanctions have undermined the private sector and the middle class while enhancing the power of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. By removing foreign suppliers of military industrial goods, analysts have argued, sanctions created a vacuum that was filled by the Islamic Revolutionary Guards. This process was reinforced by the Guards' official position as the guardian of the revolution. It has also been argued that sanctions had greater negative effect on the private sectors because foreign concerns and investors were barred from working with Iranian commercial communities. Now, the rise of Guards' economic and political power, however, cannot primarily be attributed to sanctions. This rise is not confined to Iran. The military involvement in the economy has also occurred in China, Egypt, and Pakistan, to give just a few examples. And these countries are not under sanctions. More crucially, the Guards' increasing political clout is an outcome of the historical process of changes in the nature and composition of the power bloc under the Islamic Republic, and of the power consolidation by the office of the supreme leader. Let me elaborate. If we were to summarize the political history of the Islamic regime since the 1979 revolution into three categories, these are as follows: ideological fundamentalism, pragmatism, and military fundamentalism. That is, in this period, three major shifts have occurred in the power blocks of the post-revolution regime. The first transpired when the liberals were kicked out of power. This was a shift toward revolutionary fundamentalism. This shift occurred by Ayatollah Khomeini's resorting to unconventional politics, which included the seizure of the US Embassy, the launching of the Cultural Revolution, calling upon the Iraqis to overthrow Saddam Hussein, which contributed to Saddam's decision to invade Iran. The second shift in power bloc entailed the launching of a thermidor and pragmatic politics. It brought Khamenei and Rafsanjani to the pinnacle of state power. The conservative pragmatism of this period culminated in the rise of reformist movement, where the reformists won both the presidential election in 1997 and parliamentary election in 2000. However, President Khatami and colleagues were unable to cause a shift in the power bloc. Ayatollah Khamenei, aligned with the Revolutionary Guards, managed to disrupt, disorganize, weaken, and destroy the reformist movements, culminating in the third shift in the power bloc, which is the election of Ahmadinejad in 2005 and the rise of military fundamentalism. Ayatollah Khamenei had to rely on the Revolutionary Guards in consolidating power. This is because the traditional religious establishment was not happy with him and his support for Ahmadinejad, and he had limited popular basis of power. Ahmadinejad's populist domestic policy and his stance on nuclear issues might have resonated with the interest and the desire of certain section of the population in the early period of his presidency. However, this policy fell far short of generating revolutionary enthusiasm among the public, and his anti-Israeli, anti-West rhetoric failed to rally the Iranian public to his cause. Effective sanctions, in my view, are smart sanctions. Smart sanctions are those that effectively undermine the repressive capability of the regime, including the Revolutionary Guards, while enhancing the power of the democratic opposition. One thing is clear: both intellectual trends and changes in the political and cultural attitude of ordinary Iranians are toward nationalism and liberal politics. Scholars of Iran's intellectual development have shown the rise of Islamic modernism and liberalism among the educated elite in the past decade, as is well documented by my colleague, Professor Kamrava's major book on the topic in 2008. The shift toward liberal and nationalist values among Iranians is also documented by two full-scale national surveys carried out in the country in 2000 and 2005. These surveys have shown that a larger percentage of Iranians support individualistic values. A larger percentage of Iranians support the idea of gender equality in 2005 than they did in 2000. And a higher percentage of Iranians adhere to territorial nationalism than to religion as the basis of their identity. As the percentage of Iranians who consider themselves as being Iranian above all has increased between the two surveys, and the percentage of Iranians who define themselves as Muslim above all declined in the same period. Despite these changes, there is a real gulf between the concern of domestic democratic opposition in Iran and those of the international community. The opposition cares deeply about the issues that affect the daily lives of the ordinary Iranians, including deteriorating economic conditions, political corruption, and lack of democratic freedom. The Western governments, on the other hand, are not concerned with how Iranians live their lives, but rather with problems of terrorism and the weapons of mass destruction. Bridging this gulf is thus necessary in order to seize the opportunity for democratizing Islamic Republic and for convincing the ruling elite to abandon its nuclear program. Therefore, the challenges by the international community is to devise a series of steps that effectively reduces the regime capability, but at the same time increases the effectiveness of democratic and moderate oppositional forces. The current crippling sanction may in fact undermine the regime. They may at the same time destroy the organizations of civil society and undermine the morale of the opposition. Smart sanctions are good. Current crippling sanctions that are comprehensive and universal, which adversely affect the lives of all Iranians, are simply won by other means. Thank you very much.